Hello. Welcome back to the Space School. Like always, I'm PBSW, your favorite hangout place. Today we're back with another Star Wars story. Today we'll be going back into the first Star Wars film and looking into what would have happened had Obi-Wan escaped the Death Star, continuing the trend of someone surviving an Obi-Wan and Vader duel. Before we begin this video, let's smash that like button, try and shoot for 2,000 likes in the first 24 hours, and we will release What If Mace Windu Trained Obi-Wan Kenobi. This is a video you definitely don't want to miss. We are also gunning for 50,000 subscribers, so join the Space School if you want to be a part of our incredible journey here together. If you have ideas for videos, leave them down below. I do read over comments, but I don't do crossovers. And one last thing, if you want to support the channel, check out the Patreon, Twitch, and community Discord. Special shout out to George Stewart, Benjamin Wells, Gort, Chancellor Yulon Sanders for being Grand Tier supporters, and Jay Hoffman, Icy Raptor, War Pigman, Throwaway as Master of the Tier supporters on our Patreon. Thank you guys for supporting the channel. You guys are helping fund massive projects coming out late this month or early next month. And if you want to learn how to win a free Sideshow collectible, watch the end of the video and I will tell you how. Our story begins inside of one of the several hangar bays inside of the first Death Star. The rebels have been fighting the good fight, and after a decisive loss, but hopeful victory at the Battle of Scarif, the fledgling rebellion had the chance at redemption and possibility to succeed. During this current moment, though, 5 rebels were currently on the Death Star: the princess from Alderaan, a former Jedi Master, a smuggler, a formerly trapped Wookiee, and a moisture farmer from the sand world of Tatooine. The main group, which has Han Solo, the smuggler, Leia Organa, the princess, Chewie, the Wookiee, and Luke Skywalker, the farmer, were currently making their way around the main hangar bay so that they could escape the Death Star. At the same time, Jedi Master Obi-Wan Kenobi was currently beginning his duel with his former student, now Darth Vader. It had been said 9 years before that Anakin was dead, and while Obi-Wan knew he could probably beat Vader again, he was getting older and more fragile. Obi-Wan sauntered around the corner and looked at the mask. He saw Lord Vader, standing quietly at the end of the hallway. All that could be heard was the heavy, mechanical breathing of the Dark Lord. Obi-Wan ignited his lightsaber, and Vader tried to talk a tough game. Obi-Wan knew this all too well. It wasn't the first time that he'd talk a tough game before losing a fight. He'd done it during sparring matches when Anakin was just a Padawan, he'd done it as an adult when he lost to Obi-Wan on Mustafar, and even more so, he did that as Vader on that foggy moon, the one that Obi-Wan defiled his former student yet again. Vader this time believed he was the master, and the truth was that Vader was only a master evil. Obi-Wan's quick rebuttal sent Vader into a tailspin of anger. He had 19 years to think about revenge. All during that time, he was thinking about how he could possibly beat Obi-Wan Kenobi. Vader swung violently forward as he tried to cut Obi-Wan into pieces. Obi-Wan moved back into a defensive position as he blocked gently and moved out of the way. Obi-Wan had been through this exercise before with Skywalker, as he tried to stop this forward assault. Vader was powerful, and he was patient, which meant that Obi-Wan had to be extra careful in this fight. Vader had been thinking about this rematch for all the last 9 years. He lost twice in a row, and both fights were embarrassments to his new master, Sidious. Sidious was extremely disappointed in Vader's inability to beat Obi-Wan, especially since Sidious had always doubted Kenobi up until he beat the most powerful being in the galaxy on Mustafar and then on the moon. Obi-Wan and Vader dueled back and forth as their blades glided across the walls of the Death Star. The two duelists fought each other with great precision. Their blades touched as they paused in the middle of the room, walking in circles just as they had on Mustafar. Obi-Wan was very clearly an old man, and Vader doubted any of his abilities as they fought with one another. Vader swung at Kenobi, barely missing the old Jedi, as he clipped the wall, sending off a massive explosion. On the other side of the hangar bay, the four looked as they saw a group of stormtroopers waiting outside of the Millennium Falcon. Vader and Kenobi kept dueling, as the corridor hallway doors opened and exposed the two to the hangar bay. The stormtroopers in the hangar bay turned around as they saw two glowing swords swinging back and forth, and in their determined ineptitude, they abandoned their station to see what all the ruckus was about. Obi-Wan noticed the stormtroopers running over. He of course knew how reckless they were and how easily they could be used against Vader. Obi-Wan kept the Dark Lord of the Sith at bay as he turned his head and saw Leia after all these years. She really grew up, and now she was such a capable leader. Obi-Wan turned his head back at Vader. He needed to make sure he could give the Millennium Falcon some time, but in order to do so, he needed to keep Vader away from the ship. Obi-Wan dueled with Vader as he used all of his momentum to throw Vader off of balance. though Obi-Wan did this by relinquishing his own power and making Vader feel more powerful. Just like Obi-Wan did on the moon so many years ago, he spun his blade around and Vader overstepped. Obi-Wan cut into the back of the Dark Lord as Vader tripped and slammed into the wall, as Obi-Wan used all of his might to force push Vader into the wall further, and he used the Force to push the 5 or 6 stormtroopers off the ledge in the hangar. Obi-Wan was worried about Vader pulling the Falcon out of space, so he stepped out of the corridor and closed the doors and sauntered his way to the Millennium Falcon. As the 2 droids and the 4 crew members jumped into the ship, Han and Chewie ran to the cockpit and started up the engines as Obi-Wan got himself into the Falcon as the ship took off. Obi-Wan made his way to the cockpit, telling the 2 to avoid the rebel base. Han didn't know where the base was, but he asked why they should do that. Obi-Wan knew what the Empire would do, and he knew that the Empire would be tracking them. They did it before when he saved Leia from Fortress Inquisitorius, and he knew that they would do it again. Han nodded, even though he was in disagreement with it, and then realized that there was a trail of TIE fighters tracking after them. Han jumped and ran past the older man as he told Luke to get to the guns on the bottom of the ship. Luke jumped down the ladder as he began operating the guns on the back of the ship. Chewie, Leia, and Ben all in the cockpit as Chewie began to pilot the Falcon back and forth, maneuvering to avoid the TIE fighters. Han and Luke continued fighting off the TIE fighters with the top side and bottom side weapon systems. Leia told Chewie that they needed to get to Yavin 4. Obi-Wan then told Leia that they couldn't go there, as Leia asked why they couldn't. Obi-Wan knew that the Empire would track them and reminded her of the way that they tracked both of them back to Jabim all those years ago. Leia knew that Obi-Wan was right, even though she didn't want to agree with it, as she told Chewie to take the ship to a planet that would keep the rebellion safe. She told them to take them to. Obi-Wan interrupted as he told Chewie to go to Telos IV. It was far out of the way, and it would be a place of refuge for a short while. Obi-Wan had other intentions for taking the group of Jedi and the group of crew members there. Luke and Leia were together for the first time since they were separated after being born on Polis Massa. That was a very big reason for it. While Leia was super excited to be with Obi-Wan, her biggest concern was the rebellion and saving the people from the Death Star. Obi-Wan knew this, and so he wanted to make sure he kept the Millennium Falcon away from the rebel base in case that the rebels were discovered. Obi-Wan had been so focused within the Force because of his training with Qui-Gon, his Force sensibility was extremely heightened. The Millennium Falcon continued fighting off TIE fighters as the freighter jumped into hyperspace. Luke and Han met up in the middle of the ship as they smiled at each other, shaking each other's hands. They both did well fighting off the TIE fighters. Obi-Wan walked out into the main area and sat down. He was a bit tired after dueling with Vader. He looked at Luke and then at Leia as she walked out of the cockpit. The 2 droids sat near the Jajark board. Obi-Wan thought for a moment. Something felt so right about being here. Luke and Leia, R2 and C-3PO. Obi-Wan was sitting with the entire pride of Anakin Skywalker. He felt a bit of completion with himself, and that completion was being with the children and creations of Anakin Skywalker. Of course, only one other being here, knowing just as much as Obi-Wan did, and it was a little blue astromech. Obi-Wan had to lie about not recognizing the droid. To a certain point of view, R2 understood. Obi-Wan couldn't reveal the truth to Luke yet, but now it was all out of the box. Obi-Wan figured he needed to do something. He couldn't just hide the truth forever, and after all, Leia was an adult now. It was time for her to know as well. Obi-Wan always felt that Leia knew, and while he told her about the qualities she possessed that belonged to both of her parents, it was time for Luke and Leia to meet their parents, and it was also time for them to meet their sibling. Obi-Wan had just told Luke the story about Anakin Skywalker, and the truth was that he never wanted Luke to resent Anakin. It wasn't Anakin's fault, and Obi-Wan never blamed Anakin, regardless of what Vader told him 9 years ago. While it was apparent that Anakin forgave him, Vader was all that remained, and it was ever so apparent that Vader was the only one that would be there. Obi-Wan knew he couldn't turn Anakin back, because the dark side was who he was now. Obi-Wan leaned back and looked at Luke and Leia. He couldn't hide this. No, he couldn't. Obi-Wan didn't know if there would ever be a better time to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. He could explain to both of them who their parents were and tell them the truth of their lineage. Obi-Wan looked at Leia, and she knew that Obi-Wan had something to say. Obi-Wan knew this trip to Telos IV would take a couple of hours, and that amount of time would be the amount of time he needed to tell them the truth. Obi-Wan spoke up and asked Luke and Leia to sit down. They looked at him, and they moved their way over towards him and sat down on opposite sides of him. Han leaned against the wall. For Han, this was really weird. He had no clue that the old wizard had a minor influence on both of their lives. Of course, Obi-Wan saved Leia and spent a couple days with her earlier in her life, but for Luke, Obi-Wan had a simple gift the gift of a Skyhopper toy, something that, as minor as it was, would influence Luke to eventually get his own Skyhopper and fly through Beggar's Canyon back on Tatooine. A simple gift that had a greater inspiration on a boy who just wanted to be like his father, the father he never knew. Obi-Wan sighed. He told both of them that it was time that they learned the truth of their lineage. Luke spoke up, suggesting that his father wasn't a great star pilot or a Jedi Knight, and Obi-Wan waved his hand as he said that it was all true, but what was also true is that Luke's father was Leia's father. Obi-Wan turned and looked at both of them. He said that the two of them were twins, born 19 years ago on an asteroid moon of Polis Massa. Luke and Leia looked around Obi-Wan, and they looked at each other. They raised their hands to each other as they looked deep into each other's eyes. There was a very obvious reason to doubt that they were siblings. Of course, Obi-Wan could know, and of course he would be the only one that would be there to know, but there were so many questions that both Luke and Leia had to ask. Obi-Wan knew he had to tell the truth, and he spoke up. He said that their father was the greatest Jedi in generations. Their mother was a child queen, and she eventually became the Senator of Naboo during the most pivotal time period in recent galactic history. The two of them fell in love. Anakin broke the Jedi Code by marrying Padme. Obi-Wan then continued telling that the two of their parents continued to love each other dearly, and Padme gave Anakin the most security and love that he'd ever felt in his life. Obi-Wan paused, but Luke and Leia had their eyes peeled on the Jedi Master as he thought. Then he said something he himself couldn't believe he was going to say. He told the two that their father was manipulated by the Sith, and he was turned to the dark side. What then happened to the good man that was Anakin Skywalker ceased to be, when he was taken over by Darth Vader. Leia's jaw dropped. Luke wasn't familiar with the Dark Lord of the Sith by name, but Leia, on the other hand, was literally just tortured by him and watched him and Governor Tarkin blow up her home world, with her mom, her dad, and her lovely little droid called Lola on it. Obi-Wan placed his hand on Leia's shoulder as she put her hand on his, just like when they escaped Fortress Inquisitorius. Leia looked at Obi-Wan as she asked what would convince him to become so vile. Obi-Wan sighed. The pain could be seen in his eyes as he told her that there were many reasons, but Obi-Wan told them that Anakin was tricked by a lie. Everyone was. The Jedi, the Republic, the galaxy. He was trapped by Sidious and became Vader. Luckily, Padme gave birth before she passed away. Obi-Wan then spoke up, saying that both children were just like their parents, and while Leia knew this, now she really understood everything that Obi-Wan had told her so long ago. Obi-Wan then said, but at the end of the day, at the end of the story, that both children had to be separated. Luke asked why, and Obi-Wan explained that as much as he knew, the Emperor knew as well, that if Anakin had children, they would become a threat to his power. If they were found, then they would be subjugated to a life of pain and suffering. Luke stood up and said that he wished Obi-Wan would have been his parental figure rather than Owen and Beru, who are now dead. Obi-Wan sighed. He told Luke that he wanted to be, but Owen became very decisive over Luke, became very defensive, very possessive. Obi-Wan expressed several times that he wanted to train Luke, but he was never allowed to. He was told to go away. Leia then spoke up, questioning why she was never trained. Obi-Wan looked back over and sighed, saying that he wasn't able to do that either. He was told to watch over Luke. That was his direction, and that was his mission. Leia kind of understood, but Luke pouted as he stormed away from Obi-Wan and Leia. Obi-Wan shook his head. Luke was just like Anakin before the Clone Wars began, a rowdy child with little discipline. But it wasn't his fault. Luke had every reason to be upset, and Obi-Wan didn't blame him. Leia looked at Obi-Wan and said she would talk to her brother alone. Obi-Wan nodded and looked at Han, who smirked, saying that it was quite the predicament that he got himself into. Obi-Wan looked at Han. Kenobi remembered Haja from Dayu. Han reminded him of Haja. Obi-Wan smirked, thinking from the former Jedi that wasn't really a Jedi. Han sat down and leaned back as a cool kid would, as Chewie made his way over to the table and sat down near the board game. R2 rolled over and nudged Obi-Wan. Kenobi looked down at the droid and placed his hand on the droid's head and apologized for acting like he didn't remember the little droid. Obi-Wan wasn't sure if Luke was ready to learn the truth. Obviously, it didn't seem he was. The little droid just whistled at Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan smiled at R2 as he pat him on the head as R2 settled down next to Obi-Wan. Han looked at Kenobi as Obi-Wan turned over and looked at the smuggler and said that Han didn't need to act tough. There was a good heart in him, and it was in there somewhere, even if he didn't want to accept it. Han looked at Obi-Wan. He raised one of his eyebrows as if he was begging the question. Obi-Wan shook his head as he smiled. Han knew Obi-Wan was right, but he didn't get a response that he wanted from the old man, as the old man sat there quietly. Han shrugged his shoulders at Chewbacca, who was just looking at the two of them. A little more than an hour would pass by as Luke would come around the corner with his sister's hand on his shoulder as she walked with them. Luke apologized for acting out towards Obi-Wan. He expressed that he wished he had the opportunity to learn the ways of the Force earlier. Obi-Wan understood. As he stood up, R2 kept close to his heel. Obi-Wan said, as he looked at both of them, that was why he was taking them to Telos IV, to retrieve some ancient Jedi holocrons. Obi-Wan said that he would begin to train them in the ways of the Force, but they needed the holocrons for their progression and teaching. What was even better was the fact that the Empire would be chasing down the Millennium Falcon, thinking that the rebels were currently going to their hidden base. Leia smirked. She spoke up saying that it would give them time and times for the rebels from Scarif to make it back to Yavin 4 before the Death Star got there. There were several people that escaped Scarif, but they were currently separated from Yavin 4 and the rest of the rebel fleet. One of those was the legendary Hera Syndulla, who was separated from the rest of the fleet after the Death Star and Vader's flagship arrived. Along with General Syndulla were several more fighters, starships, and more. Regardless, as the Millennium Falcon pulled through hyperspace, Obi-Wan told Han that he would be paid handsomely for this extra trip. Leia spoke up. The smooth, well-spoken adopted daughter of a queen and a politician said that the rebellion would compensate well, especially if Han and Chewie joined the fight. It was important the rebellion had everyone that they could get, everyone they can muster for the fight against the Empire. Han said he wasn't interested. He was offered before Enfys Nest nearly 9 years ago, but he wouldn't do it either. Han wasn't interested in death by the Empire. He had enough experiences in one life, one of which being an Imperial pilot for that evil regime. Eventually, the Millennium Falcon pulled out of hyperspace as the ship moved down to the surface of the planet, where there was remnants of a Jedi temple. Obi-Wan told the four that they needed to work diligently. He then remembered that C-3PO knew how to fly, so he asked Han if 3PO would be able to wait in the cockpit. Han nodded, as 3PO went to the cockpit to await orders. R2, on the other hand, would come with the group. Obi-Wan knew the droid well enough to know that being told to stay with the ship on Mustafar left the little astromech with a little bit of trauma. It was true. R2 never liked being told to be waiting with the ship after the incident on Mustafar, so he trailed closely behind Obi-Wan. Out of everyone, he trusted Obi-Wan and Leia the most. The group went into the Jedi Temple as R2 rolled forward and opened up a massive creaking door. Obi-Wan watched as dust and sand crumbled off the old doors of a massive ancient Jedi Temple. Obi-Wan stepped forward, igniting his lightsaber, adding light to the entire hall. The halls were tall, dark, and hollow. The air was damp and stiff. Han turned on a flashlight as Chewie turned on a light on his bowcaster as the group continued to travel forward. Luke and Leia stayed close to Obi-Wan as he used his hand to guide him forward, relying on the Force and its energy to show him the path and the way that they were looking for. There was an archive here, and Obi-Wan wanted to find it. Even more so, there would be a place full of lightsaber hilts that Luke and Leia would be able to use for their future lightsabers. Obi-Wan found a patch that he wanted to go down, and as he pulled out a small satchel, he filled it with lightsaber hilts so that he could use them in the future. Obi-Wan then continued down the corridor. He looked in front of him. It was a massive door frame that had no port. Obi-Wan looked back at Luke and Leia and asked them to come forward. They both stepped forward, and Obi-Wan raised both Luke and Leia's hands. He told them to focus on the Force surrounding them. Obi-Wan told both of them to feel the Force flow through them, and then envision the doors being opened, and let it happen. The children of Skywalker listened, as they were commanded, and used the Force to pull the door. It croaked and creaked as the door shook back and forth. Obi-Wan smiled, telling them to continue, to keep trusting themselves and keep trusting the Force, that no object was too big for them. Luke was beginning to give up, and Obi-Wan could feel it, but Leia was growing more and more into it. Obi-Wan told Luke to trust in the process more and more. Luke started to give up, though. Obi-Wan placed his hand on Luke's shoulder as he told him to never give up. Luke focused on the Force, and the door began to slide on the hinges, as the door itself croaked its way across the hinges as the massive door opened up. Obi-Wan looked at both students as he placed his hands on both of their shoulders, telling them that this was their first step into the life of a Jedi. Han stood back and watched as his jaw was wide open. Chewie was little to react because he had seen Grandmaster Yoda several years before during the Battle of Kashyyyk. Han carried on behind them as Obi-Wan led the group to a shelf, and on that shelf he sorted through, looking at the holocrons trying to find the right one. He told everyone to grab what little they could. Han reached up and grabbed some artifacts, stuffing them into a little bag of his own. C-3PO then contacted Obi-Wan, telling him that a massive structure just arrived out of hyperspace. The Death Star was here. Obi-Wan told C-3PO to get the engines ready. They needed to get out of there immediately. Everyone turned and ran for the door. Obi-Wan was the last one behind the group, as they started to haul their way out of the Jedi Temple. Luke and Leia ran with Chewie and Han, as R2 and Obi-Wan followed closely behind. The Millennium Falcon began lifting off the ground as they all ran into the interior of the ship, as the Death Star prepared to blow the planet off the galactic map. Han ran into the cockpit and set coordinates for anywhere he could and pressed the levers down for the jump to hyperspace, as the Falcon was still on the surface. A second later, Telos IV no longer existed, as it was blown out of the sky. The Falcon traveled through hyperspace as Obi-Wan asked Luke and Leia how they felt about using the Force. They were both a little shaky with it, but Luke was a bit less confident than his sister. It wasn't necessarily his fault, though. Leia had an unwavering determination to succeed. Luke was just a moisture farmer. He was naturally gifted at being a hero. He needed to learn how to trust his abilities, and trust the Force, and himself. Obi-Wan would begin to teach the two Jedi for a short little while, until the Falcon eventually came out of hyperspace. The ship arrived outside of Ryloth. As Han and Chewie looked down at the sandy planet, during the course of their trip through hyperspace, Han and Chewie had been searching the ship for any signs of the tracking device. They couldn't find it on the inside, so the presumption was that it was placed on the exterior of the hull. They needed to be quick. There was a good chance that the Death Star would be following them to Ryloth as well. The added benefit of having Ryloth being an Imperial-occupied planet meant that they may not destroy the planet if the Death Star arrived. Inside of the Death Star, Vader sat quietly in his quarters. He was filled with unbelievable rage. He lost to Kenobi again. It wasn't enough to lose to him as a Padawan, not enough to be embarrassed by him on Mustafar, not even enough to be the first person to cut through his mask as Vader on that foggy moon so many years ago. Even more, he lost to an aging old man. Vader sat facing himself inside of his meditation chambers. His pain was amplified as he dwelt on the dark side of the Force. He thought about Kenobi, and the reaction Kenobi had to the Princess of Alderaan, inside of the hangar bay. There had to be a reason as to why Obi-Wan reacted as such. Even worse for Vader, he had a communication come in from his master. Lord Sidious got into contact with his apprentice, and demanded to know how he failed. Vader didn't speak. His helmet wasn't even on, and Sidious was raged beyond belief. He couldn't believe the performance of his lackluster apprentice. Vader was supposed to be the most promising apprentice in galactic history, being the most powerful being ever seen in the galaxy. Vader was a disappointment, and Sidious made sure that he was fully aware of his disappointment in him. Vader held his face together without rage or sadness, showing nothing as he took in the rage that was coming from his master on the other side of the communications device. Vader sat and took it all until Sidious turned off the device and let Vader sulk in his failure. Vader didn't move until he was hailed to the main bridge. The Death Star was approaching Ryloth. Telos IV and Ryloth weren't exactly too far away from one another, and the massive battle station was closing in. On the surface of the Dust Bowl, Han was on top of the ship, while Chewie was on the bottom. Luke and Leia were on other parts of the ship, looking and searching for anything that they could find. R2 was also tapping into the mainframe to see if there was a sensor he could detect. Eventually, they got the tracker off the ship, and they would be able to escape the system before the Death Star got there. Before they ditched the system, they placed the tracker on a small moon outside of Ryloth, so that the Twi'leks wouldn't face the same fate as the Alderaanians. Millennium Falcon, after several more hours, would arrive outside of Yavin's system. Their destination was the fourth moon by the name of Yavin 4. The moon was a thick, forested jungle, with massive ancient pyramids rising above the tree line. The Falcon had very important information that they needed to deliver. It was all the information the rebels retrieved from Scarif, the information regarding the Death Star plans. The rebels had mostly regrouped by this point. There were B-Wings, Y-Wings, and the Ghost was back. The rebels had a proper strike force, and with the new information alongside of the rescued princess of the former Alderaanian people, the rebels had the motivation to succeed. After Alderaan and Telos IV being destroyed, the rebellion knew they needed to strike at the heart of the Empire. They needed to destroy the Death Star. Currently, the massive space station was sitting outside of Ryloth, threatening to destroy the planet for existing in the same area as the Death Star itself. With people relying on the rebellion, this could be what the rebels needed to bolster their movement against the Empire. A fleet was gathered up together. mostly fighters. Luke was given a chance to fly his very own X-Wing, alongside of Biggs Darklighter and Wedge Antilles. The Rebel task force was strong enough, and it would be perfect to take on the Death Star. Han Solo was given his reward for helping the Alliance, but after all was said and done, they thought that he would maybe join him. Han was reluctant. After a rebuttal from Luke, Han pondered what he would do next. Regardless of a decision, the rebels were getting ready for their assault on the Death Star. Leia and C-3PO made it back to the control room, while Obi-Wan would consult Han Solo. Obi-Wan knew that Han was a good man, and so he tried to get Han to admit that he really did care about Luke after this little journey, and at the end of the day, he really did want to do the right thing and get the girl. Han tried to be a tough guy in this routine, but Obi-Wan didn't let up. Of course, he let Han go, but he knew that Han was a much better person than he ever admitted to be. Obi-Wan left Han alone and walked towards the control room, where Leia was. R2-D2 was with Luke, just like he would have been with his father. Inside the Death Star, Vader stood on the bridge next to Grand Moff Tarkin. The Grand Moff said that there was no sign of anyone on the moon, and that the rebels found the tracker and removed it before making the jump to hyperspace. Vader was very obviously rattled by what was just said by Grand Moff Tarkin. Vader looked out of the viewport and saw the planet that was adjacent to the moon. Vader turned and looked at Moff Tarkin. While Moff Tarkin was cold-blooded, manipulative, and essentially the Emperor's little dirty work guy, he thought even this was too far. Tarkin was suggested to make an example of the Twi'leks. This wouldn't help the political situation at all. Even though the Imperial Senate was dissolved by the Emperor, Vader said that the planet needed to be destroyed, as an example to the galaxy. As the guns loaded up to destroy the planet, a commander on the bridge called out, reporting that a fleet was coming out of hyperspace. Tarkin asked if it was Imperial, since the Empire was known to frequent the area a lot, because of rebellions back and forth led by Hera Syndulla's father. The officer reported back, telling him that it was fighters. As Vader saw from the viewport, dozens of fighter craft disengaging from hyperspace. The rebels were here, and they were ready to do justice for the galaxy. Hera Syndulla was leading the assault as she checked in with everyone and with their squads. Everyone rang out their codenames. B-Wings, Y-Wings, X-Wings all called out their detail as they informed up behind the Ghost, which was preparing to operate in formation of victory against the Death Star. The starfighters rose to the top of the superstructure as many of the pilots gasped at the size of the Death Star. The starfighters rose as the X-Wings and B-Wings locked their S-foils into attack position. Ben, inside of the control center, would feel the force flowing through Luke. He knew that Luke had it in him to take the shot. Ben knew he would be able to communicate to Luke through the force, without having to open his mouth, but he believed that in exercises from earlier in the day, might be able to prove useful during this experience, trusting the force around him and doing what it took to make the shot land. Hera let the ships down and into a tunnel as they glided under the turbo laser cannons. The real trouble began when TIE fighters started to appear. The Ghost pulled up and out of the trench as it turned around, followed by 3 X-Wings, including Biggs, as they turned to fight the incoming waves of starfighters. They needed to protect the bombers. Vader was still inside of the command deck. He was waiting until the Death Star blew up Ryloth, and then he would go out and finish the job. He wanted to see the Twi'leks die. The sight of seeing another planet vanish would be peaceful to him. Until then, he waited idly and patiently. Vader looked over and saw the countdown timer as it slowly crossed into the time of final ignition. Outside of the massive base, dogfights ensued, and then another unidentified craft entered out of hyperspace. Tarkin, assuming it was another rebel, was surprised that it was a Corellian fighter. Odd, he thought, until one of the officers identified the ship to be the same ship that was previously captured. The Millennium Falcon boosted up the side of the structure as Han Solo and Chewie blasted through TIE fighters that were trailing the Ghost. Gold Squadron was running down the side of the Death Star as they prepared to launch their torpedoes. It looked like the same trench from the blueprints for the battle station that they saw and were shown earlier at the Rebel base on Yavin 4. Gold Squadron was then intercepted by a wave of TIE fighters. Luke and Red Squadron pulled around the edges of the trench as they collided with the TIE fighters, instigating another dogfight. Luke and Red 5 pulled away from the dogfight, as if something was pulling him in the direction that he needed to be in. Just a little bit away, Gold Squadron launched its torpedoes, as they missed their target and slammed into the outer layer of wall protecting the Death Star corridors. Red 5 continued down and around as he barreled off from the main group. At the same time, inside the Death Star, the ignition switch was pushed in as the Death Star began to illuminate with green pulses as Hera Syndulla, native to Ryloth, fought off TIEs as she saw from the corner of her eye the planet she had been raised on be obliterated. A moment of shock filled her mind and her heart as she lost all concentration on the battle at hand. A wave of TIE fighters pulled up behind her, laying into the rear deflector shield, as the ghost shields began to buckle under the pressure. Chopper, who was in front of her, tried to take over the control ship, but Hera was lost in the moment as rubble of her homeworld started to shatter out across the edges of space. The Ghost was beginning to sustain damage, and then a massive freighter came barreling around the corner with its blasters ablaze. Han Solo cleared up the Ghost as the Millennium Falcon pulled around. Han was looking for Luke. Old Kenobi was right. He did have a good heart, and he needed to find his new friend, because if he didn't, he could very easily be killed if he wasn't already. Luke, though, was pushing his X-Wing to full speed down the trenches of the Death Star. On the interior, Vader informed Governor Tarkin that he would deal with the fighters on the exterior. Tarkin nodded as he watched the black cape flutter deviously in the wind as Vader marched out of the command bridge. In the trench, Luke was alone. He had only himself as he got his scanner out and pushed further and further down the trench. All of a sudden, he heard Obi-Wan's voice telling him to trust in the Force. Trust? Don't think. Luke asked over the comms if Obi-Wan said anything, to which there was no response regarding something said by Ben. But then Obi-Wan spoke up. He told Luke to trust the Force. He knew that Luke would miss if he trusted the scanner, just like he initially struggled against the training droid. Luke pulled back the scanner as he focused on the Force, just like he did before. This time felt more confident towards the Force and its instincts. Obi-Wan continued talking through the Force so that no one else could hear him. And the command room on Yavin 4 had all their eyes on the fleet. With the Ghost, they were able to watch with the basic hologram projection of the battle, as Luke could be seen on the far end of the projection getting closer and closer to his target, as he felt the shot come closer and closer. The Millennium Falcon pulled around to ensure cover for Luke as he held his breath, closer and closer. The moment was right. It was right now. Luke pulled the trigger on the torpedoes as they launched and slid down a tiny shaft. Luke whipped his X-Wing around and out of the trench as he chanted that the shot was away. The rebel forces pulled away from the Death Star as they were trailed by TIE fighters, but it was no use, as the Death Star with Tarkin, Yularen, Vader, and several more high-ranking Imperial officers were dead within an instant. The Death Star exploded behind the rebels as they all closed S-foils and jumped back into hyperspace immediately. On Yavin 4, celebration commenced, and within hours when the rebels arrived, they celebrated the destruction of the Death Star. Inside of the Ghost, General Syndulla sat alone with her Kalikori in her hands and tears in her eyes. She sat alone inside of her quarters while her son was in the other room quietly sleeping. Hera lost her entire planet and the remnants of her family. After everything the Twi'leks had been through, this was their greatest challenge. The Death Star claimed the lives of 3 planets and ripped apart 2 others, those being Scarif and Jedha. Without the Imperial Senate, it wasn't a big deal for the Emperor to tell the galaxy off like it was nothing. But with 3 entire civilizations wiped off the face of the galactic map, there might be a little issue. With 3 new asteroid belts where there used to be planets, the galaxy rose up. There would be an immediate response against the Empire, and there would be infighting within the Imperial ranks. Their disappointment in their cause and the anger and rage of what they did to innocents built up and boiled over. The Empire still had strength, but destroying 3 entire planets and then losing the Death Star without even stopping the quote-unquote bad guys seemed a bit of overkill to them, especially when at the end of the day millions of Imperials were killed inside of the blast. While some Imperials would see this as more of a reason to destroy the rebels and wipe them from existence, others saw it as penance, even for those with family members or friends inside of the Death Star. The planet-killing machine was operated by people, and it was destroyed by people. When the news of Telos IV and Ryloth followed the news of Jedha City and Alderaan, the galaxy was on edge, especially with an emperor who just dismantled an entire galactic senate. Little did the rebels on Yavin 4 realize the domino effect that this would have on the galaxy, but for now, it was pomp and circumstance for the brave pilots of the rebellion, with Han Solo, Chewbacca, Hera Syndulla, and Luke Skywalker being recognized for their actions to save the galaxy from losing one more planet. After the pilots arrived and initial celebration, the 4 who saved the galaxy, and while yes, sadly, weren't able to save Ryloth, were all given medals for their actions. A massive celebration, and even better for the rebellion, they had no need to relocate. The Empire had no whereabouts regarding the hidden location of their base. Any information that whatever could have been used to discover the location was lost within the Death Star. The Emperor in his residence on Coruscant would begin to get pissed again, sending out all of his Imperial fleets to the Ryloth system to recover what little they could. There was a slim chance of anything actually being recovered, but the slim chances were worth deploying a fleet for, especially if the rebels were still out there. On Yavin, without the Empire breathing down the necks of the rebellion, Obi-Wan Kenobi found Luke and Leia. They were celebrating with Han Solo and Chewbacca. Obi-Wan asked if he could talk to the two children of Skywalker alone. Han smiled and walked away with Chewbacca. Han smirked and nudged the Wookiee co-pilot and told him that it was nice to actually be a hero for once. While there was always that need to be a space pirate inside of Han Solo, he always wanted to be a good man. Kira was right, and it drove him a little mad inside knowing that she was always right. Han then turned around and caught a glimpse of Leia looking at him. Han gave a little shrug and a wink as he continued walking away with Chewie. Luke and Leia looked at Ben. He told both of them that he would like to train them in the ways of the Force. It would be up to them. Leia understood Obi-Wan's direction. She remembered what he had told her all the way back on Mapuzio, about remembering little glimpses of her former family before he was whisked away by the Jedi Order. Obi-Wan was giving both children a chance to follow in the footsteps of their father. Leia, as much of a leader as she was concerned to just give it all up to become a Jedi. Obi-Wan told her that she could still be a leader. Yavin 4 was the perfect planet to lead from, and it was also the perfect planet for her and Luke to be trained on. Obi-Wan smiled at Leia as she expressed her excitement to learn in the ways of the Force. Luke, on the other hand, held out his father's lightsaber as he twisted it in his hand, and he smiled at Ben. The twins were both going to be trained in the ways of the Force by the same man who trained their father. Obi-Wan clapped his hands and asked for both of them to follow behind him. Han, who was very obviously interested in Leia, followed the group out and started walking into a massive courtyard behind the temple, away from the commotion. Here Ben would teach the two children their first life lessons in that of the Force. Obi-Wan was a bit old, but he got down on his knees and asked Luke and Leia to do the same. Near the entrance to the courtyard, Han, Solo, and Chewbacca sat on the steps of the temple, watching as the three knelt and closed their eyes. Obi-Wan told the two to reach out to the Force. This wasn't a physical motion, or an emotional one. Luke and Leia needed to trust that there was more inside the Force, and they needed to trust the same way they did previously on Telos IV. Obi-Wan asked what they both felt. Luke said he felt light. Leia said she felt balance, and then Luke followed up saying that he felt darkness. Obi-Wan smiled, agreeing that there was everything within the Force. He then began explaining to them that the Jedi were to harbor feelings of the light. Luke spoke up and asked about balance and why they weren't able to use balance within the Force. Ben stopped. He expressed that there was only two Jedi who were balanced, but there was only one of them who perfected it. Obi-Wan opened his eyes and said that there was once a Jedi Master by the name of Mace Windu, who knew how to use the darkness against his enemy. Mace was able to use the Force exceptionally well, and he could draw on the darkness, but it never controlled or corrupted him. While on the other hand, was Luke and Leia's father. He used both sides of the Force, but he never found true balance within himself. It was how he was able to go from the great Anakin Skywalker to the vile Darth Vader within almost hours. Anakin was very powerful as well, and too powerful for his own good, and that was something he wasn't responsible for. Obi-Wan expressed that if his students wanted to learn how to seek true balance, they needed to learn something that Obi-Wan didn't know how to teach. Part of Obi-Wan feared having Luke and Leia turn to the dark side, while the other side of him knew that both children, because they had pieces of their parents in them, were unlikely to falter to the dark side because they had Padme in them. Obi-Wan told the two of them that it would be a lesson for another time, and that they would look into it down the line. Obi-Wan had a lot of studying he needed to do before he began to even understand the concept, let alone teach it to them. It was possible one of the holocrons from Telos IV would have the information the children were curious in, but for now, Obi-Wan had to teach both children the pleasantries of the Force and how to use that Force. Of course, there would come a time for the two of them to learn lightsaber combat, but that time was not now, and that time would eventually come though. Obi-Wan taught Luke and Leia continuously for the next 7 months. Han Solo would stay with the rebellion. He would help Hera Syndulla and other rebellion leaders on special missions. Han became friendly with Biggs Darklighter and Wedge Antilles, while Hera Syndulla helped the rebellion find itself new allies. And with the Alliance Council regrouping after the chaotic split-up before the Battle of Scarif, they now knew how much having trust in one another meant. While Bail Organa was dead, it was important that Mon Mothma, leader of the rebellion, continued to stay that way. Because of the rebellion's destruction of the Death Star, many worlds around the galaxy began flying the colors of rebellion. The Emperor and his empire were doing damage control by cracking down on these worlds. But when they cracked down on Mon Calamari, their fate was sealed. The eyes of rebellion would open when the people of Mon Cala would rise up. The Quarren and the Mon Cala were able to unite against the Empire, as they sent massive cruisers to the rebellion. The memory of the late Admiral Raddus, who was executed in his flagship MC-75 above Scarif, would help bring more people from Mon Calamari to the aid of the rebellion. One notable face from that crowd was Admiral Ackbar. He had served several years with the Republic during the Clone Wars, and he truly understood what it meant to rise up against an overbearing force, overly powerful evil in the galaxy. While the Republic eventually returned to Mon Calamari with the Empire and Lord Vader to make these people suffer for harboring a Jedi, the Mon Calamari was the first of many star systems that would put their foot down against the Galactic Empire in the name of freedom for every being across the galaxy. One thing these rebels had to be careful of during the 7th-month stretch was avoiding giving away their location. Hera, having dealt with Admiral Thrawn before, knew that she had, if there was any clever enough Imperial officer to do it, which there wasn't, around the ranks of the Empire, knew that it would cause trouble for the rebellion. The rebel fleet was stationed away from Yavin 4. It was a solid staging grounds. The best part about the fleet is that it was strong enough to stand up to the power regime of the Empire. There was little chance that the Empire would try to attack this fleet unless it brought a Super Star Destroyer with them, most of which were still in construction at this point. The rebellion was growing extremely quickly. New recruits signed up across the galaxy. Even better was during the 7th-month period of time, the Empire began to crack from the inside out. Lots of doubt in the Empire led to a recruitment halt, and even more so a massive wave of mutinies across the Imperial Army, navies, and air forces. Sidious was smart though. He turned an entire republic that stood for 1,000 generations into an empire within the span of 13 years. He knew he would be able to manipulate the people against the rebellion. It didn't help that pro-Empire worlds already saw the rebellion as a banditarius, no thanks to Saw Gerrera. The Empire had to frame this against the rebellion, and that's what they did, creating pro-Empire memorials for the tragic loss of life that was the Death Star. Posters that said, "Remember the Death Star," were placed all across the galaxy to build sympathy for the Empire, but the damage was already done. Many people that mutinied began releasing Imperial secrets. While most of the mutineers weren't extremely high ranking, the few that had high ranks knew enough information to scare the public of the Empire. Most of these mutineers would be executed publicly, which drastically affected the public view of the Empire on the worlds that had seen them as heroes at this galactic conflict. The people who mutinied escaped to the hands of the rebellion, which had its outreach to those who were trying to escape the Empire and fight for their cause. The rebellion had a pride growing around it. The heroes of the rebellion were known across the galaxy, and all of them were being hunted by the Empire. With so much happening in the galaxy around, it was important for Obi-Wan to continue his training of the two Skywalker children. He was getting older, but after so many years of learning experiences and even more than that, learning from Master Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan was in a great position to be the teacher Luke and Leia needed. Both students excelled in their training. Obi-Wan didn't exactly teach them balance, but they were able to excel in their Force ability. On the 3rd month of training, they both progressed far enough that Obi-Wan began lightsaber training. Leia would use Obi-Wan's lightsaber up until the 4th month, when they would all travel to Ilum, and Leia would be able to construct her very own lightsaber. Luke, on the other hand, continued using his father's lightsaber, and Leia was perfectly fine with that. The Jedi holocrons that Obi-Wan had from Telos IV were full of information. In the 7th month period, Obi-Wan had gotten through just about half of the information, but it was evident that he had to go much further in. Obi-Wan was able to take the little information he learned thus far and use it in the training of Luke and Leia. The children both reciprocated the information very well. They reminded him a lot of Anakin. It pained him quite a bit sometimes too. They were late bloomers, and when they started to blossom, they didn't stop. Luke and Leia thrived off of one another, and they held more power between each other that they made a dyad in the Force look almost essentially useless in comparison. Though this rise in light of the Force was becoming increasingly worrisome to someone across the galaxy. The person across the galaxy was Sidious, and he knew that there was something wrong within the Force. He didn't believe it was a Jedi, but he knew that there was a rising light to meet his darkness. He knew that the rebellion thought the Death Star claimed everyone, but Palpatine always had a trick up his sleeve. For the 3 Jedi, it was finally time for them to take a trip to Dagobah and visit the former Grand Master of the Jedi. He knew about the children, and he knew that Obi-Wan had been training them, but seeing them would be otherworldly. Master Yoda would be enthralled to meet the children. especially since they had progressed so fast in their training, and they kept each other in line. It had been one or the other. It was possible that they might suffer from a lack of discipline or even inability to stay put, but Luke and Leia kept watch on one another. Even more so, Leia, being taught her entire life how to be at the top of her game and always be responsible, would keep her brother in line whenever he acted more rambunctious than normal. It was quite obvious to both Obi-Wan and eventually Yoda how much Anakin was in Luke. The trip to Dagobah would separate Luke and Leia from the rest of their friends for the first time since they all met on the Death Star. Han would cope well with this. He was now pivotal within the rebellion, and he was close with the higher-ups, partially to his bravery, but also because him and Leia had gotten extremely close over the past few months. Obi-Wan was very obviously skeptical of this, but he knew how mature Leia was, and he also knew that she was much more mature than Anakin was at her own age. Leia being around Han didn't take anything away from her, and Obi-Wan knew that trying to force Leia out of feeling anything she felt would do more damage, just like it did damage to Anakin. He thought it best to keep that knowledge from Master Yoda. Obi-Wan trusted Leia's instincts, and he had no reason to not trust her on her ability to use her instincts. The three Jedi would spend the next couple months with Master Yoda, learning a whole new aspect of the Force as they traveled down into the caves of Dagobah, and faced new challenges, and took on a new understanding of the Force itself. Luke and Leia proved to be everything that their father couldn't achieve. They brought peace and justice and everything in between to the ranks of this new Jedi Order. But there was always a great concern, and that was the possibility of falling to the Darkness. Yoda saw that as a possibility, that they could become victims to the same plague that their father was a victim to. But there was always something concerning about Leia. It wasn't her losses, she handled them quite well, but it was her attachments. An infatuation, if you will. Yoda picked up on Leia's love interest, and he thought about confronting it. Though, Obi-Wan would stand in the way, reminding Yoda what happened to Anakin. Yoda would remind Obi-Wan that Anakin turned to the dark side because of his attachments. Obi-Wan told Yoda that Anakin was a victim to the Jedi's own arrogance, saying that every single Jedi in the Order failed Anakin. The choice to continue to make him lament every decision they made, the Council turned their backs on him, and even when no one was around to save him, he turned on the Jedi, who loathed his presence the most, since he showed up inside of the Jedi Temple. Yoda pondered. He knew Obi-Wan was right, but he was still stuck to the old code. Obi-Wan looked at Yoda, and then said it was time to forget the code, and let it be gone. Obi-Wan, before teaching the children, was tied to the code himself. Other than the memories of Satine and Anakin, Obi-Wan was true to the code. Teaching these children showed him that he should have taught Anakin differently, and while that time was gone, this time was now. Obi-Wan, instead of reminiscing on the past, needed to live in the present so that he could gift the children of Skywalker to the future. They needed to build from what little they had established and grow from it, and grow beyond it, even at that. After the next few months were over, Luke and Leia would up and return from Dagobah to see that the rebellion had doubled in numbers in just 4 months. General Solo and General Syndulla led multiple operations in the Outer Rim against weakened Imperial facilities. The rebels were striking where the Empire was weak, and it would result in a unanimous victory for the rebellion. Their strikes were targeted and strategically significant. Every time the rebellion won, which was becoming more and more common, more and more people would rally to the aid of the rebellion. This aid would also strike fear in the hearts of those sitting in power, especially Grand Moffs. There was becoming a new habit of Moffs being captured and disappearing off the map. While the rebellion was actually taking care of these individuals, it drove fear into the hearts of those with power, believing that they would be targeted and killed if they continued to aid the Empire. The Moffs realized their contribution to the Empire could become deadly for themselves because their garrison numbers were frequently becoming smaller and smaller. The Empire was losing morale, and it was especially prevalent in the Outer and Mid-Rim. The core was, well, the core. It had those with the motivation to succeed under the will of the Empire, but sometimes it was hard to differentiate pride from fear. Tension was beginning to feel like it would pop. The rebellion was truly growing, and the Empire was faltering to what the rebellion was achieving. Obi-Wan knew Luke and Leia needed more training until they were ready to face the Emperor, but there was already something gravely concerning to him. It was a fact that there were rumors that Lord Vader had returned from the dead. Imperial legions led by a cloaked vile being with a red lightsaber began to squash civilizations that appealed to the rebellion. Obi-Wan knew that if he did this, it would be his last battle. He was getting too old for this, and his bones were growing fragile. The old man did what he could to train Luke and Leia, but he knew that if Vader was still on the loose, he needed to be stopped before he took the hope away from the rebellion. Though it was unlikely that Obi-Wan would be able to find Vader unless he went to the front lines of combat to confront the Dark Lord of the Sith himself. Obi-Wan had mixed feelings about this. Of course, Luke and Leia wouldn't know that this was essentially a suicide mission for Obi-Wan. The chances of him returning from this alive were very slim, but they needed to stop Vader for the rebellion. The three would load up inside of the Millennium Falcon with General Solo and Chewie. As they departed for the Mid-Rim, Vader and his Legion were last reported around Bothawui's system. They were both putting down an insurrection against the Imperial Moth on the planet. When the Millennium Falcon arrived, the crew looked out and they saw an Imperial Star Destroyer. Obi-Wan closed his eyes. He could feel Vader's presence, though he wasn't on the Super Star Destroyer. Vader was on the planet. All three Jedi could feel it. There were screams of terror before they were silenced with immeasurable pain and death. Vader was currently on the surface of the planet, and he was rummaging through towns, single-handedly tearing through communities without lifting his blade. The Falcon pulled around and landed on the backside of a city. Obi-Wan, Luke, and Leia got out as they moved towards the sounds of crying and screaming. Han told Chewie that they needed to get as many refugees onto the ship as they could. He looked at C-3PO and R2-D2, and told them to have the ship ready to go in case they needed to bail. Obi-Wan led the twins down the street, and then they saw him. It was true. Vader survived the Death Star explosion. His suit was slightly different, but mostly it was the same as it had been. Vader was inside of his TIE Advanced when the station exploded. Other than the respirator keeping him alive, he was just floating in space. Vader did survive. He stared down a corridor as he twisted the neck of an innocent man standing on the edge of a building. Obi-Wan ignited his lightsaber as Luke and Leia did the same. Vader didn't realize that these were his own children as he ignited his blade, threatening to kill all three of them. Obi-Wan moved forward. Vader was determined to not lose this time as he raised his blade and slammed down on Obi-Wan as the fickle old man reciprocated it well. Vader then moved around as he used the Force to push Luke away and block Leia with the other hand. For being such a hulking beast, Vader moved quickly and with such precision. Obi-Wan moved in to help Leia as Vader moved to defend himself. Leia pranced back, her glimmering blue blade danced around as it lit up the street. Luke got back around and struck at Vader as he blocked him, and then noticed a familiar hilt. His rage grew. He thought that Obi-Wan gave his former lightsaber to a random child. Vader swung violently as he tried to kill Kenobi. Luke swung his blade around as it clipped Vader's shoulder. He growled as he threw a massive wave of the Force at Luke, as Luke was thrown into a wall and knocked out instantaneously. Ben and Leia got side by side. They were always closer because of their early established bond, but now they had to prove it. They now had to rely on one another to stay alive, against the likes of Darth Vader himself. Vader swung back and forth as he angrily tried to strike down Kenobi. Leia blocked and moved behind Vader as Obi-Wan nodded at Leia as if to tell her to stay patient. Vader swung violently forward as Leia used the Force to throw her father across the street. Vader landed on the ground and turned around with confusion hidden under his mask. Not just any Jedi could use the Force on him like that. The young woman had to be something more than just a Jedi. Was it possible that Kenobi had a child? That seemed very unlikely. Vader rose to his feet as he watched Obi-Wan try and shake Luke to wake him up. Vader moved into attack position as he drove his blade forward as Leia blocked him and was thrown from her feet. Obi-Wan stood and fought with Vader. Their blades moved back and forth on their fifth encounter with one another. Vader got more of the upper hand as Obi-Wan's blade was thrown from his hand. It landed on the ground a little ways away from him. Obi-Wan closed his eyes as he prepared to meet his fate. Vader raised his blade as he swung. He clashed blades with a young man who was knocked out earlier. Luke stood up to Vader as the Dark Lord moved into a defensive position, trying to stop the Sith Lord. Leia got back up and blasted Vader from the side, as Vader felt his flesh pierced by a lightsaber blade for the first time in 19 years. Luke and Leia knew that this was their father, as Luke swung his blade up, crossing the bottom left of the helmet to the top right, leaving enough visibility to see one of their father's eyes. Luke stuttered back. Vader was enraged. He swung his blade down and shattered the lightsaber that Luke was using. As Luke fell back, Leia didn't give her father a chance to take anything else away from her as she brought her blade around as it passed through Vader's chest. Obi-Wan watched the eyes of his old friend widen. Obi-Wan moved in and moved over to Vader as his blade fell to the floor. Obi-Wan put his arm around the shielded shoulders as he lowered Vader to the ground. Vader looked at Obi-Wan, but the rage in his heart couldn't be shown in this moment. Obi-Wan looked down at Anakin and said that at long last, he can be free. Vader's hand made its way to Obi-Wan's arm. It could have been for comfort or for malicious intent, but it was a final action made by Vader, as his eyes dropped and he fell lifelessly back to the ground. Obi-Wan looked down at Vader. A single tear fell from his eye. Obi-Wan stood up as Leia wrapped her arms around Obi-Wan. Luke did the same thing, as Obi-Wan put his arms around both twins, telling him that it was done. There was nothing more that Vader could do to the people of the galaxy. It was saddening to the children that they had to be the ones to kill their father, but at the end of the day, it was for the betterment of the galaxy. There was no hope, no light, no peace behind the eyes that were Vader. Only in the final moments, when Obi-Wan held his fallen brother, could he see that he was relinquishing from the pain that he had always felt within himself. Their fight was not done yet. Blaster fire could be heard from around the corner as they saw Han and Chewie running away, ducking into cover. Obi-Wan and Luke and Leia ran over to see what was going on and see what they were running from. As they peered their way into the massive corridor of street, they saw about a dozen or so more stormtroopers, followed closely by an AT-ST as Bothans ran away. Han and Chewie fought back the assault. There was so much that they had to lose if they didn't stop these Imperials. Obi-Wan looked at Luke and handed him his lightsaber. Luke looked at Obi-Wan as Kenobi told Luke to use the blade. It would help the Bothans escape. Luke smiled as he ignited Obi-Wan's blue blade. The grip felt comfortable in his hands, so he looked out and then ran in front of Han and Chewie, blocking blaster bolts back at the stormtroopers. Leia looked at Obi-Wan and then looked up. Kenobi knew what she was trying to do, so she got a running start as Obi-Wan used the Force to throw her on top of the building they were sitting next to. With the Imperials distracted, Obi-Wan rounded the corner and found Han and Chewie, and told them that they needed to evacuate who they could now. Han pointed over and said that there was an important Bothan spy. They needed to get him back to the base. Obi-Wan saw the spy and told Han that they needed to escape immediately. Leia ignited her blade on top of the building as Han's jaw dropped. Leia ran on top of the building as she lunged across the sky on top of the ATS team. Luke, still fending off the stormtroopers with cover fire behind him, watched as his sister cut through the massive walker and jumped down, destroying the controls on the interior of the walker. Leia jumped through the window and used the Force to pull the walker over as she fell to the ground, landing on her feet. The walker crumbled down on top of the remaining stormtroopers. Leia ran over and started ushering the people towards the Millennium Falcon. The Bothans looked at the Jedi and began to run. Luke handed Obi-Wan's lightsaber back as C-3PO got the ship ready to launch. The sounds of TIE fighters could be heard echoing around the corners of the city as everyone got themselves inside of the Corellian freighter. The people all settled as Han and Chewie jumped into the cockpit and sent the ship barreling out of the city. TIE fighters came shouting around, and they could be heard screaming behind the Millennium Falcon. Han pulled the ship up as he made a move to the atmosphere and then saw an Imperial cruiser. Turning the ship away, he made a push toward space as he plugged in the coordinates for an underground bunker that the rebels had been using to shuffle people, refugees, and even fighters through. The Falcon pushed itself into hyperspace as several TIE fighters trailed buzzing off. In hyperspace, Han and Leia began talking to the Bothan spy, Ord Lacrai. He was an experienced spy, and he had been spending several years inside of the Empire, thinking he was doing the right thing for the galaxy and for his people. It really wasn't his fault. The Empire had a good ruse to make people believe that they were fighting for the right cause, but the Death Star changed all of that. Elsewhere in the galaxy, Lord Sidious sat quietly in his abode, anger rising in his heart. He knew that Vader was dead. This time, he was really dead. He was nursed back from death twice, and this was the final straw, the final time that he really did die. He lost to Kenobi again, it seemed, and now Sidious was going to overturn every single rock in this galaxy to find him, so that he could kill Kenobi himself. For what he did to Vader, Sidious's prize apprentice had been foiled by one Jedi, and this Jedi alone was causing Palpatine so much suffering in terms of having an apprentice. Part of Sidious respected the fact that Obi-Wan was able to beat Vader so many times, but because of that, he loathed Kenobi. Vader's arrogance was his downfall. Sidious now had to focus on what he would be able to do with the absence of his apprentice. On Yavin, after a couple of jumps, the Millennium Falcon returned, and Ord was immediately brought to the command deck. Mon Mothma, Admiral Ackbar, General Syndulla, Han, Chewie, Luke, Leia, and Kenobi all stood around listening to what it was that Ord had to say regarding the Empire. It wasn't uncommon to have a spy here or there, or even have spies who had information that was important to the cause, but apparently Ord had the reputation of getting top-secret information, though it was mostly coincidental. running into him on Bothawui. He happened to be there at the same time Vader was. Rumor even had it that he was one of Vader's most trusted officers, but no one really knew, or really cared at this point. Vader was dead. The Rebellion Council stood around the holotable as Ord plugged in a drive of information as holograms began to appear left and right. During the invasion of Bothawui, Ord had full control over Vader's Executor-class Star Destroyer, and he was able to hack into the head of Imperial intelligence with it. When he was able to get into that information, he revealed thousands of data cards that could be useful to the Rebellion. One of those that was mostly concerning was the Emperor's plans to build another Death Star. There were certainly other plans for the Empire, but at the moment, the Emperor was mostly concerned with getting rid of this rebellion. If he got rid of them, then he could go on to worrying about other things that really concerned him, things that would continue as they had for the last 19 years, before the destruction of the first Death Star. The data cards revealed that the second Death Star was being built in the Endor system. The space station wasn't even inhabitable yet, it was just an exoskeleton of what it would later become. There was also information regarding Imperial fleet movements, weaknesses and strengths of Imperial Star Destroyers, and even the location of the Emperor's personal Star Destroyer called the Eclipse. There were little gasps here and there, but the overall consensus was that the Rebellion was going to get a hold of the Eclipse. It was a super Star Destroyer with a super weapon at the end of it. The Rebellion didn't know if it was completed or not, but if they got their hands on it, then there was a possibility the Rebellion could easily put an end to Imperial projects, and put an end to the Empire as well. With such a large data leak, the Rebel leaders ushered Ord out of the command deck and began discussing strategies. One strategy that came to mind was the destruction of the fleet besieging Bothawui. The reason that was such a great concern was because if the Rebellion could destroy it, then they could have a new sense of patriotism in the Mid-Rim. Bothawui was a central location and a much-liked planet in the divided Mid-Rim. Both sides of the fight were distraught that Bothawui was being besieged, and it could be a massive morale boost for the rebels in the Mid-Rim that still hadn't come out yet. Hera suggested that the rebels use this as a diversion to get to the Kuat drive yards and take over the Eclipse. It was a risky mission, especially because of how dense the Kuat drives are with Imperial Star Destroyers. The ship that went to Kuat would have to be very sneaky and small. A young man stepped forward saying that he would have no issue with leading a small rebel task force to do this, suggesting that the Moldy Crow, leading a wing of U-Wings, would go to the Kuat drive yards and sneak into the Eclipse. Kyle Katarn had been around for a while, but this was the first time that he'd have a really large mission on his hands. He was allowed to be in the higher-up meetings until only recently, so this was a lot of trust being entrusted in him. Hera thought for a moment. His heart reminded her of her beloved Kanan Jarrus, so she spoke up saying that Kyle would lead a group of rebels to Kuat to steal the Eclipse, while Admiral Ackbar, General Solo, and General Syndulla would lead a rebel fleet to Bothawui to destroy the Executor. Admiral Ackbar spoke up, telling them that this time they needed to be prepared. Hera and Han looked over with confusion, as Ackbar spoke about the Battle of Scarif, which was only a year before. He said that the rebellion almost fell apart due to bad planning. Ackbar suggested that rebel forces have a system to regroup at in case there was a fundamental issue with their strategy during the battle. Everyone agreed that a good planet to regroup at would be Dantooine, which wasn't terribly far away from the battle. The plans were set. The rebellion, with a large fleet, mounted up everyone so that they could be prepared for them to enter combat. The rebel fleet, which was mostly not present here, prepared when the orders were given. Within hours, the rebel fleet was in hyperspace, equipped with several MC variants and enough firepower to destroy 3 Super Star Destroyers. The rebel fleet exited hyperspace, and immediately, Admiral Ackbar began assigning positions and groups to different sectors, as Green Group, Blue Group, and Red Group led the charge. Luke Skywalker was now a pivotal member of Red Squadron alongside of Biggs and Wedge. The Millennium Falcon and the Ghost led Red and Blue squad of A-Wings and 3 squads of B-Wings. The rebellion was in full force as every squad of Y-Wings carried out the back of the pack. These Y-Wings would be used to destroy the shield generators on the Executor. The Empire was completely caught off guard. Most of their fleet was out of position, and their troops were also spread all across the ground. Immediately, the Executor was requesting reinforcements. From Kuat, 14 Star Destroyers were sent to back up the Imperial lines on Bothawui. Kuat was close enough that the fleet would be able to assist the Super Star Destroyer within hours. Simultaneously, as the fleet began to leave, the U-Wings and the Moldy Crow began to approach the Eclipse. They couldn't send any transmissions out because they were in Kuat system, and it would alert the Empire to their presence. Outside of Bothawui, the Empire was getting pummeled. Rebel ships began to besiege the Executor, tearing down its shields and ripping the ship to shreds. Most of the Imperial Star Destroyers around Bothawui were leading different aspects of the campaign on the ground. They had to pull away from supporting their troops to stop the rebels in space. The Rebel fleet disabled the Super Star Destroyer and was working its way through the rest of the fleet that was currently present, as the elite Rebel pilots made short work of newly recruited TIE fighter pilots that were still trying to fight back. The Empire stood little to no chance, while the Rebellion was quick to put them on their heels. Broadcasts across the galaxy showed the Rebellion taking control and stopping the Empire from destroying yet another civilization, the civilization of Bothawui. Another fleet was dispatched. This one was also carrying a Super Star Destroyer. The Empire was willing to throw its resources at Bothawui, because if they could destroy this fleet, it would be able to stop the Rebellion. The individual Star Destroyers that were on the surface, that were now moving to get back to the fight, were getting absolutely destroyed, and hunted down by several squadrons of Rebel starfighters. Star Destroyers were great ships for flagship-to-flagship combat, but they couldn't really defend themselves from the onslaught of fighters that the Rebels had. The Rebel fleet set itself up to be prepared for any incoming fleets that might come to destroy them. The only thing that would be able to stop this Rebel fleet was the fact that they could be sandwiched, or they could be faced with an interdictor. Ackbar was prepared in case that happened. He had a strategy in mind, On Kuat, Kyle and the group of rebels infiltrated the Eclipse, and were slowly but surely making their way to the command bridge to acquiesce themselves a Super Star Destroyer. The rebels began making sure the ship would survive a jump to hyperspace, checking everything they could to ensure that the ship would be able to get out of the system without any issues. They began sorting through all the ship's vitals and information. They had to be quick with this, but everything was looking hopeful. The Empire was completely distracted by the Rebellion's move over Bothawui. Now the comm chatter was completely and entirely focused on external issues instead of internal issues at Kuat. Kyle then discovered that the weapon was operational on the Eclipse and wondered, and then figured it out. He just had to be sure that nothing would inhibit their ability to escape the drive yards. The Kuat fleet arrived over Bothawui into a frenzy of fire. The Rebellion wasn't playing around, and neither was the Empire. This fleet of Star Destroyers was less than what Vader's former fleet had, but because Vader's fleet was so divided during their campaign, they were easy to pick off. This fleet would be a challenge because they were in formation. Ackbar knew it would be trouble, but he told the fleet to move into close proximity with the Imperial Navy. The officers on deck tried questioning his decision, but Ackbar knew how the Empire operated, and he quickly understood that in this moment his opponent would try to sandwich them with another fleet, one from the front and one from behind. Placing the Rebel fleet in the middle of the Imperial fleet would create collateral damage. Even more so, it gave the Rebel fleet some time to send their starfighters to destroy shields and cripple the Imperial Star Destroyers that they were about to face. On Yavin, Obi-Wan and Leia were currently siphoning through old Jedi holocrons to see what they could find, to see if they could find anything that Luke and Leia could learn, so that they would be prepared. The time was coming for them to eventually face and end the Emperor's reign. Luke and Leia were extremely powerful, and their peak power was just around the corner. The Rebel fleet began to get into close combat with Star Destroyers, as their powerful shields held a stiff resistance against the Imperial heavy guns. The Imperials were soon relieved to see another Super Star Destroyer arrive out of hyperspace. Han Solo communicated to Hera, telling her that he would take a couple of wings of X-Wings around to fight off the Imperials that had just arrived. Hera told him that once the command ship was taken out, she would be right behind him. Ackbar's decision made more and more sense at this moment, and he seemed to be like a genius for moving the Rebel fleet into this position. The Imperial Super Star Destroyer began to fire at the Rebels, but the fire was only doing damage to Star Destroyers, and only clipping the Rebel craft here and there. The Millennium Falcon darted back over the rubble of the other Super Star Destroyer, with Luke and wings of fighters behind him. Back over Kuat, Kyle told the crew to power up the super weapon. The Imperials inside of the massive drive yards began to panic, thinking that the weapon was accidentally activated, like it was some sort of mistake. It was no mistake. The Rebellion was going to squash the Imperial drive yards, as it was one of the most important Imperial facilities in the galaxy. Within instance, the renowned Kuat drive yards crumbled under the power of the super laser shot from the Eclipse. Kyle turned around and told the men inside of the ship and the bridge to prep the engines for a jump to hyperspace. The Eclipse's engines ignited as it began pushing forwards as the hyperdrive was activated and the ship began to steady itself forward. Over Bothawui, the situation got stiffened, as the Imperial fleet from Kuat fell apart. The new fleet from another mid-realm world had 16 Star Destroyers and several support ships. The fleet was incredibly well put together. The Imperials came here with a desire to win. Then all of a sudden, from the surface of the planet, wings of Bothan fighters and Bothan capital ships began to besiege the Super Star Destroyer. Even more so because the battle was being broadcasted across the galaxy, individuals with the inspiration to help joined in. This was clearly not a battle of numbers, but it was a battle of master flanks. As the rebels continued and finished the Kuat fleet, they turned their attention towards the Mid-Rim fleet. Home 1 began to take a severe beating as an MC-75 saw that Admiral Ackbar's ship was taking heat. Admiral Holdo saw that if she didn't go in, Admiral Ackbar could be lost, and the battle itself could follow that. Just as the Executor mounted up its maximum firepower, Admiral Holdo's MC-75 pulled in front of Home 1 and took the entire beating. As the ship evacuated under loss of shields and eventually the hull itself, Admiral Holdo was killed in a blast as a Super Star Destroyer's firepower slowed down as the MC-75 became disabled and began to float adrift down to the surface as its hull began to tear apart from the inside out. Admiral Ackbar understood the sacrifice as he told the fleet to mount up against the Super Star Destroyer. At the same time, Hera Syndulla led a wave of Y-Wings over the hull of Home 1 as she sent the bombers towards the Super Star Destroyer. TIE fighters were already struggling, but then when A-Wings and B-Wings joined the combat, they began to truly falter. Katarn and the crews of the U-Wings were able to pull the Eclipse out of the Kuat drive yards. Little did they know that when they destroyed the space station with the super laser, they destroyed the planet's interdictor field, so that they could be free and clear to leave without any issues as remnants of the Kuat fleet that didn't leave for Bothawui began approaching the Super Star Destroyer. Kyle punched the hyperdrive and the ship was gone, lost in the depths of space. Back on Bothawui, the rebellion was beginning to leave its mark on the hull of the Super Star Destroyer. The Imperial fleet, with an overzealous admiral and some incompetent officers, began splitting up into an attempt to stop the destruction of the another capital ship. This failed as well. Separating themselves from the protection of their support ships led to an absolute destruction and oblivion for the Imperials. The rebellion pushed their advantage, and Admiral Ackbar claimed the largest victory in the name of freedom since the Battle of Coruscant. The Imperials left, surrendered, and were given a fair chance to leave the Empire and fight for the rebellion as a pension, or if they didn't, they would be put in prison, and probably face prison for a long time once a new order was restored to the galaxy. Most of these Imperials would actually join the rebellion. Their faith was lost in the Empire. After all, today was the worst day the Empire had ever seen. They lost 3 Super Star Destroyers, the entire Kuat drive yards, and 3 of the most powerful fleets in the entire Imperial Navy. With that, there was a lot of rallying behind the rebellion. The rebels returned to their secret base, and when they returned, there was an important meeting, not just for the Jedi, whose ranks had begun to increase, but for the rebellion, who, with the massive boost in motivation, increase in their ranks, and of course the morale growth from the Battle of Bothawui, was ready. Coruscant was their target. The Council agreed. Not a single one of them had doubt in the rebellion's ability to succeed. Of course, this would take months of planning, but now with the Eclipse, there wasn't anything that would be able to stop the pursuit of freedom. Everyone agreed. In a month, they would take Coruscant. As for the Jedi, Obi-Wan figured out the balance lesson, and now he knew how to teach Luke and Leia what they needed to know, and how they would be able to stop the Emperor and destroy the legacy of the Sith once and for all. Obi-Wan would also suggest to the rebellion that to ensure this never happens again, they would need to destroy Sith temples after the rebellion claims victory on Coruscant. Obi-Wan would have to also send Jedi Katarn out to Coruscant. He was going there to rally the people against the Empire. The plan was quite simple. They needed to destroy Imperial morale, and then when the riots started and intensified on the ground, the people themselves would be liberated almost instantaneously for their work and their dedication towards freedom in the galaxy. Kyle would depart immediately, and the time for the rebellion would slowly count down. It would feel like eons waiting for the day of the assault, each day feeling longer than the last, as the rebellion prepared itself for the day of reckoning the galaxy needed oh so desperately. If they could do this, if they could save the galaxy from the heartache and suffering, they would be heroes. Kenobi would train Luke and Leia, and they would approach their true power. Yoda would be brought to Yavin 4 to oversee the ending of their training. The rebellion was ready, and their movement was as well. each day building up the morale shot through the roof, as there was no way that they were going to lose this battle. This battle for their friends, families, systems, everything here was on the line. For the Empire, the protests quickly erupted into violence, and the people of Coruscant quickly realized that they were in a war for their own, as they began to fight against the Empire a week before the rebels' assault. The week would eventually pass, and the day would come for the rebellion to restore hope to the galaxy. The morning of the assault, Luke, Leia, and Obi-Wan were discreetly dispatched to Coruscant in the waning hours of the galactic civil war. Not long after Kenobi and the twins arrived, the rebel fleet was inbound. The Eclipse was sent at a different time than the rest of the fleet. The entire fleet was separated into 4 different task forces. The rebels couldn't risk having the Eclipse come out of hyperspace too early. It was the element of surprise that would catch the Imperials off of guard. Even more so, the Imperial Navy planned for this. Because of the riots on the surface, the Empire assumed it would only be a matter of time before the rebels arrived. Everything was counting on the rebels' ability to beat the odds, because here and now, the entire Imperial Navy was essentially stationed to protect the capital. Sidious was on the surface, preparing plans to resurrect himself should his empire fail. Though these plans were only in their infancy, and the only other person who knew them was sitting in one of the 2 Super Star Destroyers hovering over the world. Accompanying these 2 Super Star Destroyers were 36 Star Destroyers. There was also 1 SSD in reserve, and a fleet of 12 more Star Destroyers waiting for the rebels to advance. The rebels, because of Kyle, knew what they were getting into. So initially, the rebels were sending in all of their fighters. It would be ships that couldn't be shot down by SSDs or ISDs. It would drive the Imperial fleet out of position. Then the rebels would send in Task Force 2. So as the starfighters exited hyperspace, with Han and Hera leading the charge, the rebels were able to obtain some quick victories, as the massive rounds fired by Star Destroyers missed just about every single shot they shot. U-Wings, B-Wings, X-Wings, Y-Wings, V-Wings, just about any fighter the rebellion could get their hands on was here. They even had some old Vulture droids from the age of the Clone Wars. The Imperial fighters stood a chance, until they didn't. Their momentum was easily thrown off, and when Task Force 2 exited hyperspace with the heaviest ships in the Rebel Navy, the Imperials assumed that they had them. Their ranks were filled as 12 more ISDs and 1 more Super Star Destroyer came out of hyperspace. The rebels didn't have anything firing because they used all of their power on their shields, which were holding. Mon Cala cruisers were renowned for being able to withstand any number of firepower from any vessel. As the Imperial fleets arrived, Task Force 3 deployed behind a 3rd Super Star Destroyer, which was all alone. The ISDs were spread out closer to the Mon Calamari cruisers. Task Force 4 then deployed smaller vessels meant to draw fire as they arrived closer to the main force. Rebel bombers began making their runs across the Imperial front, and then the last one arrived. While the Eclipse wasn't technically a task force and it wasn't fully manned, the most important role was here: the super weapon and the shields. While the Eclipse was never really meant to survive the battle, it arrived out of hyperspace immediately and fired its weapon. Though coincidentally, because of the faulty planning, the original 2 Super Star Destroyers that were lined up next to each other. This was to increase maximum firepower on any given target. Though they assumed the rebels couldn't man the entire Eclipse, they were right. The rebels had enough men to man the ship and the parts that mattered. On the surface, the Jedi crept into Sidious's residence, where they heard the ancient dialect of the Sith speaking into an altar. They found Sidious. He saw the 3 Jedi and hissed with anger. While Sidious was very powerful, he was a very old man, though he ignited his lightsabers. Red ignited the side of the room he was on, as green and blue ignited the opposite. While Anakin's lightsaber was destroyed, Obi-Wan kept it as a memory of his friend. But Luke finally built himself a new lightsaber, one that had a green blade, and a hilt much like Obi-Wan's. Obi-Wan moved in, surrounded by the children of Skywalker. Sidious could immediately tell that they were the power that was growing in the Force. What he did not know is that they were the offspring of his former student. Sidious used all of his strength, all of what he had left, as Luke and Leia darted around each other, using each other to their advantage. In space, the conflict was heating up. With 2 Super Star Destroyers being destroyed because of a super laser, most of their systems were offline. They still had numerous amounts of weapons that were functional, but what they had left of most of their systems were failing. The Star Destroyers immediately went into chaos. With Admiral Pride out of combat, the Imperials lost their advantage. Task Force 1 and 3 began their assault on the last Super Star Destroyer. As for the main Rebel force, they lightened their shields and immediately got into combat. This was their time to win, and win they would. As the rebels pushed back against the Empire, the Eclipse would fire another round, and eventually another round, after recharging the super laser several times. But by the time they fired their last shot, the Empire was running, with nowhere in the galaxy to go, without their Emperor, and without a survival plan. The Empire was ready to collapse. On the surface, riots became victory marches, and inside of Sidious's residence, a lightsaber duel turned into a match of force abilities that he would lose to Luke and Leia Skywalker. In the next couple of months, the galaxy would change forever. The Empire was ousted from power, and the rebels rose to immediate power in the galaxy, and liking in the galaxy. Luke and Leia accomplished what their father could not, and with a swift defeat of the Empire, the age of Imperial reign came to an end, as Mon Mothma would reinstate a republic. For Luke and Leia, their time serving the rebellion would come to an end, as the day would begin a new order of Jedi. Old Ben Kenobi would take the mantle as Grand Master, as Yoda would fall ill and died of natural causes, after watching the children of Skywalker grow into the mantle of the Chosen One. Though this new order of Jedi would be heavily influenced and inspired by the life of Anakin Skywalker. As the Jedi taught themselves peace and justice, they also taught themselves balance within the Force. With that balance, they were allowed to fall in love. Leia would kindle her relationship with Han, as Chewie would depart for Kashyyyk looking for his family. Han and Leia would have a child, and they would name that child Ben. As the time passed, Grand Master Kenobi would eventually pass away, leaving the title of leadership to his two final students. The Jedi would rebuild, the galaxy would rebuild, and in an era without the Sith, they would persevere in peace in the galaxy forever. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our story. Again, special thanks to George Shore, Benjamin Wells, Jay Hoffman, Warpigman308, AC Raptor, Gort, and Chancellor Yolanda Sanders for supporting the channel. Let's hit 2,000 likes on this so we can see what if Master Windu trained Obi-Wan Kenobi. If you want to see a what if, let me know down below. I read our comments, but I don't do crossovers. Check out the Twitch, Discord, Community Discord, and Patreon if you want to be part of our community and support me in other ways. And if you want to know how to win a free Sideshow collectible, we are doing this giveaway until the last day of July. So what happens? We have to hit 35,000 subscribers by July 31st at 11:59 p.m. Just like you're turning in a late term paper, you have to have it done by then. If it's at 20, if it's at 34, it's not happening. But what happens? You go down below, you click the link, and the link takes you to a doc. The doc is the doc, and you read the doc, and you just put your name there. Anyways, let's talk about our story. Our story is it's interesting. I actually didn't think it was this long. I really just started writing it, and it was one of those stories that just kept going. And I'm actually really happy with how it turned out. I think the story is honestly quite beautiful, and it really took on a presence of its own. Having Ben in the situation doesn't really change the events. Having Ben tell Han to go away from Yavin changes the events. And I think there's a lot of inspiration here from the Kenobi show, and I wanted to take as much information that I could from different periods. And that's what I really tried to do, right? The most obvious thing is Obi-Wan references to Obi-Wan Kenobi show. And I wanted to make those references because, I mean, that information is there. That information is for us to use, and I wanted to use that. And I think it added to the story greatly. I think that the story was emboldened by the ability to capitalize off of the Kenobi show. Because, I mean, you have 6 episodes that add to the canon, and you just get to take advantage of that. And having the duel with Vader, and even having the relationship built between Leia and Obi-Wan early on, is that you can add that to the story, and that becomes very pivotal in the story because Luke and Leia have to build this bond because they first learn. And I think the biggest issue that people are going to have with this is Obi-Wan deciding to tell Luke and Leia about their lineage, because he obviously didn't do that in the main story, but he also never had Luke and Leia together, right? He never interacted with both of them at the same time. And I think that would change his perception on things, and I think he would actually act differently because of that. In regards to everything else, though, I think the story is perfect in length. I think it's a nice story for Rebellion, and I had fun adding other characters too. I always try and be fair to everyone here. I have my own feelings towards the sequels, and I know everyone does. Everyone has their own feelings towards the sequels. But I like adding characters from the sequels, because at this point, I can add them. I can add Holdo, I can add Pride, and I wanted to, because I wanted to incorporate them into the story, so that you guys can have a new level of respect for each of these characters. And while I don't really care how you think about these characters, and I really don't care about them myself, I wanted to add that extra part to the story so that it feels like it's part of a wider universe, right? These characters that we've seen before, these characters that we know from movies, they're now existent, and they didn't really exist for long, but you know, that was the point. I wanted them to feel a part of the canon that I'm creating in this story, and that's the fun that is this story. And having Kyle show up was, I'm sure you guys will love that. But I mean, there are a lot of fun things in this, and I think this story capitalized off of the lack of original trilogy stuff that I've done recently. Most of my stuff focuses on the Clone Wars era, and there's only so much you can do with the Clone Wars era. And I think this story really capitalizes creatively off of the lack of content that I've done regarding the original trilogy, because I don't do a lot of original trilogy stuff, and we got some new original trilogy stuff coming out in the next little bit of time, so I'm really excited for that. But a lot of my stories have focused around the Clone Wars, like the one for tomorrow, and I think this story was able to be capitalized off of the amount of stuff I've done in the Clone Wars. And I think because I got to spend, you know, an hour and a half, probably, maybe an hour and 45 minutes here, just doing a story about the original trilogy. And I think the story capitalized off that. And expect more original trilogy stuff, because I got some stuff coming for the original trilogy. But anyways, guys, regardless, I hope you guys enjoyed this. This story was a lot of fun. My favorite parts was the space battles. I'm a huge sucker for space battles, and I think the battles between a rebellion that, and by the way, this rebellion that we're talking about, this rebellion is at the strength of the rebellion that we see in the last movie, Return of the Jedi, right? It's that kind of fleet. It's a big fleet. It's big, right? It's not about numbers though. It's about strategy, about master flanks. Remember that. Always remember that. It's not about strategy. It's about master flanks. Get shafted. Anyways, shameless plug-in for Zanny. Big fan. Anyways, guys, I hope you all enjoyed this. This was a lot of fun to do. Expect more fun videos coming out in the future. Subscribe so we can do that giveaway for the Sideshow collectible. We're also getting 50,000 subscribers, so let's do that. Got massive projects for you guys. I love you all. Spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.